Hey everyone, and welcome back to Amaranth Bay. If you'll remember back to last episode when I mentioned that we were going to reroute the freeway away from the shoreline, well, today we're going to do just that, in addition to building a historic brewery district in the vicinity. As usual, of course, this build is going to be inspired by the analogous area in Duluth. After demolishing the old stretch of freeway, I'm going to use Network Multi-Tool to start the new route going in parallel with the curved stretch of road next to the hospital that I made last episode. And then I'm going to lower this all down so we can get a nice sunken freeway. I think I mentioned this in the last episode, but my idea for the origin of this freeway is that it follows the course of a large former rail yard that used to serve the industries on the nearby peninsula. And now there are just a couple of tracks left on either side, and both of them are still in use. So we have the problem of, if we want to reroute the freeway at all, we're going to have a crossing of some kind. Obviously, we can't have a level crossing with a freeway, so we have to do this underpass. So I'm just going to lower down the freeway just a little bit, and then I'm going to cheat a bit by raising up this rail. Even though it's all meant to be at ground level, I'm just going to raise it up just that little extra bit so we can have enough space here for trucks to pass underneath. So with that out of the way, I wanted to adjust the rail junction so that it takes up just a little bit less space, because I think the overarching point of this whole project is to maximize space along the shoreline while still respecting the original infrastructure like the rail and, of course, the downtown grid, which I'm going to expand right now. I realized that the easiest way to make this freeway look like it was fit into a pre-existing grid was to just build the grid first and then add the freeway, and then rework any little bits here and there that I think the city would want to be adjusted to fit the new environment. It sounds completely obvious when I say it out loud, but for whatever reason, that's just not something I've ever done in the game before. So with the grid built, I added a little stretch of freeway over to the right where it breaks out of the downtown area, and then it's as simple as connecting them up with Network Multi-Tool. It might look weird to have this really gentle curve against the rigidity of the grid, but it's going to make more sense in just a minute once we start making some more adjustments. So I'm deleting any stretches of road that overlap too much with the freeway or with the rail, and also most of the segments that cross the freeway at a perpendicular angle. And then I'm just trying to make use of the remaining streets and alleys to create a new avenue. So it crosses over to the brewery area from the hospital, and then over where the rail and the freeway start to converge, it crosses back over into the downtown grid. Before getting to the brewery area, I wanted to detail up the rail overpass and the surrounding area. The Railway 2 pack, which I'm using, has a lot of great network bridge options, although it did take me a while to make sure I was doing it correctly. It might be hard to see here, but at first the width of the rails was mismatched between the bridge and the normal network, but eventually I figured out that I just needed to use node controller and change the node type to get these to line up perfectly. Luckily for me, Railway 2 looks so good that I don't really even need to detail that up at all, so I can focus on more enjoyable things like manually lining up this grass network with this retaining wall. One feature that I wanted to yoink from Duluth is these spots where the freeway is covered for a short distance, which someone told me are called caps. So we're going to have a few of those along this route, starting with this one, where the new avenue crosses over the freeway next to the hospital. I'm going to basically use the same technique to detail all of them, using this squished down concrete block as a kind of frame around it, and then filling the whole thing in with ploppable grass. I also wanted to include some more decorative elements. I didn't have any assets that fit in with the retaining wall network that I'm using, so I decided instead that I'd go in the exact opposite direction, and instead of trying to blend something in, I'm going to use something completely different. So I ended up settling on using this bridge piece as a kind of decorative buttress. It's probably a bit more Pacific Northwest looking than Midwest, but I don't really mind that because it just looks pretty cool, honestly. And I think that using a bridge motif kind of evokes the city's history and the city's silhouette, since eventually we're going to have multiple bridges spanning the bay, although at the moment we only have one, but that's an issue for another day. Before building the main part of this cap, I had to figure out what the exposed portions of the freeway would look like so that I could integrate them as seamlessly as possible into the caps. So I whipped up a tiered retaining wall system using walls and grass networks and some concrete barriers as well. So with that ready to go, it's time to fill in the cap. So I started off using ploppable grass, and very quickly I realized that there is a very unfortunate bit of slope along the park. So I have to start using grass networks, which is a little bit more difficult. But luckily the other caps that we're going to be building later on are completely flat, so it's going to be a lot easier to fill in those. On top of all that, I wanted to make a simple park inspired by the J. Cook Plaza in Duluth. So there's a simple path network, and that's going to allow relatively easy pedestrian access to the Brewery district from downtown, at least relatively easy as far as a freeway-centered area can be. It was a little tough to fit into the slope terrain, but I managed to get it eventually. Then we have the centerpiece of the park, but unfortunately most of the statues in my collection didn't work in this elevated location. Apparently Frederick Douglass is a fluid, and George Washington is way too big and can't be turned into a PO. So by default, I went with the only other statue I had, which was this Mozart fountain. So I guess the people of Amaranth Bay are just really big fans of the magic flute. On the other side of the freeway, the detailing is going to be a bit simpler. There's been no development, and there's been no chance for mature foliage to grow here since this spot has been next to an active rail line for decades and decades, so it just has some grass and some very sad-looking trees in between the two lengths of track. It's nothing too exciting, but I didn't want to leave it completely empty before we move on. We just need to do one more thing before getting to the Brewery district, and that's to lay the groundwork for the other freeway caps, just to get a sense of what the overall area is going to look like. Not actually going to get to detailing them this episode, we're just getting them ready for whenever we get to this northeastern end of downtown. So here's cap number 2. Just ignore the giant hideous gray triangle. I was thinking at first we'd end up putting a parking lot there or something, but scrap that idea later. So for the third cap, I wanted to take inspiration from Duluth, of course, where there's this funny little wall with a path on it that connects the next cap to the previous one. Because these converge down to a pretty small point, I think it's easier to actually build the retaining walls manually right at the end here, rather than using IMT like I've been doing before. So I'm going to use the exact same assets and just slot them in carefully with Move It, and then fill in the whole area with a grass network, and I'm going to use node controller right on the end just to shrink it down where it converges. Went ahead and added these concrete beams, filled it in with grass, and like usual added the decorative buttresses. And we're not done. The middle one is way too small, so I'm just going to expand that really quickly, and now we're ready to go. I think it'll help to shift our perspective around here since we're mostly going to be facing the lake, for this next part of the build at least. I had originally planned to fill in all the caps and this part of the downtown grid in this video in addition to the Brewery district, but as usual I ended up detailing way too much, so we're only going to get to fill in this much this video. But I think it's going to be a cool spot, so there's that. I took inspiration for this build from the Fitger's Brewing Complex in Duluth. The Real World company operated from 1881 to 1972, and the building now is apparently used as a shopping center of sorts. In our perfect fictional world, no breweries ever go out of business, so this one is still in operation, but we'll get to the functionality of it later. First, I wanted to get started on the layout of the buildings. I started by using this Dubuque malting and brewing asset by Darf, arranging the pieces in a kind of mirrored S shape to evoke the shape of the Fitger's complex. Because I'm using them in an arrangement that isn't really intended, I also had to clean up the street level view by isolating the first floor from this asset and lining up multiple copies along the street. I ended up cutting most of this footage out for a reason that'll be clear in a minute. But first, if you're sensitive to violence, you may want to look away for a second. Yeah. Normally I wouldn't turn a parking garage into a PO because it loses its functionality and cars can't park on it, but in this case I wanted the top floor of the garage to be at ground level, just like the real thing. So to do that I had to turn it into a PO and lower these fences down so that it can be in line with the ground level up here. And I'm just going to go ahead and add some car props off camera later on so that it can still look like it's in use. The reason I didn't show too much of the building placement before is that they were pretty quickly unplaced by the game. I think it might have something to do with the individual buildings being meant to serve as sub-buildings of the main asset, and PO not liking that for whatever reason, but I couldn't get them to stay, so I decided to replace the ones that disappeared with a row of structures more in line with the Fitger's complex. I also added some spots to the surface parking lot, just in case you were interested in that. Since part of this complex is meant to be an active brewery, I figured it would make sense to have a loading area in this lot, because it's really the only accessible spot on the building. So I'm going to designate this end of the complex as the packaging and warehouse facility. It's a pretty low-tech solution over here, just a dock and a couple of garage doors. I realized a bit too late that this is an extremely awkward spot for trucks to back up, but I was in too deep at this point, so I just went with it. I also realized that I didn't have an industrial-looking roof asset. So instead, I took an industrial-looking building asset with a roof built in and squished it down with PO, just like they do in real life. Finally, I took the spawn point for the main rectangular building over on the avenue, which is functionally an industrial building, and moved it over to the loading dock in the hopes that trucks will come and go from this location instead of over on the avenue. For branding, I wanted something that was fictional but still interesting and also had a variety of assets available for it. So I ended up using these Mount Gray props from a fictional brand pack on the workshop. Now you might be wondering why a place in Minnesota has mountain in the name, and so am I. I liked the look of this face of the Fitger's building where the sign pokes out from behind this wall of ivy, so I decided to create something like it. In this case, I had to spell out the name myself in PO, which was really fun. And obviously it looks horrible right now, but I was hoping that once I added the ivy in, it would blend in a lot better. Adding in that ivy was also very fun. I tried to speed up the process by copying and pasting these columns of it, but it made it look way too tiled. So I had to go back through and jumble up the pieces quite a bit to try to cover that up. Finally, I thought it still looked a little unnatural to have just this big square of ivy, so I decided to extend some bits of it off to either side. Thankfully, the rest of the branding was a lot easier than all that, other than the fact that the only awning I could find in this shape was part of a rickshaw asset, so I had to mess around in PO to isolate that. But other than that, it was very easy, and I'm just trying to carry this green color scheme throughout the whole thing along these storefronts. Now with all that done, we're going to head around back, first adding in a little access road and parking lot in the spot where the cross street would have been back in the day, and then getting to work on some detailing to make this place look more alive and more like the inspiration in Duluth. My idea for the modern functionality of this building is that it's still a functional brewery, like I said before, but the operations are pared back compared to in the past. Historically, it would have been the main regional producer of beer, but as large multinational breweries like Miller and Budweiser and took over the role, Mount Gray had to change their tactics, so they basically downsized to become a medium-sized craft brewery. As a result, they now lease out some of the remaining buildings in the complex to various businesses. So in the end, we have a mix between the modern functionality and the historical one. One of the businesses they lease out to is a restaurant, or maybe it's just a brew pub that's part of their business. I don't know. Either way, they have a sizable patio out back, which has taken over part of the landscaped area and is kind of cloistered off from the rest of it with a bunch of plant pots. I figured that this place would want to take advantage of the views you could get from this landscaped area in the back. So I'm going to go ahead and add a seating area over here, and then plant a grand old tree right in the middle. Maybe it's been here since before the brewery was built, or maybe they hauled it in to make this spot feel older than it actually is. But either way, I think it would make for a nice seating area to take in the view of Lake Superior, at least during the summer, maybe not so much during the winter. Just like with the other side of the complex, I wanted there to be an access area for the backs of the shops. Over here, they've used some old decommissioned kegs as bollards at the end of it, which I think is kind of a funny little detail. I'm also going to drag all the shops' spawn points over here so we can have the truck traffic redirected to the back, rather than incessantly stopping on the avenue, backing up traffic, and all that. Next up are a couple more details on the brewery side of things. First off, I wanted to replicate this huge brick chimney from Fitger's. I really like the way these tall old chimneys are fitting into the city skyline, so I'm going to add these wherever they make sense and maybe some places where they don't. I tried adding our branding to it, but this asset seems to make really good use of tiling with its texture, which kind of makes sense because it's brick. I mean, that just kind of works well. So unfortunately, I don't think we're going to be able to add our branding. To get smoke to come out of it, I'm going to raise up this table prop so that I have something to align the smoke prop's height with, because you can't actually see where the smoke is coming from in real time, so that just makes it easier to get it to the right spot. I thought that maybe the tallest of the buildings in the complex would have originally been the main brew house, but after downsizing, they decided to convert it into a hotel. So here on the back, we have the more expensive Lakeview rooms with some balconies and chairs attached. This is the only door asset I had on hand. I think it works okay as like a retrofitted sort of door. And I'm just going to take this whole assembly and copy and paste it onto every pair of windows. I'm also going to add a historic water tower on top here, which presumably they don't use for brewing anymore. They're just tapped into the city's water and they run it through some sort of reverse osmosis system or something like that. That's probably going to bring the value of these rooms on the left down a little bit, since they get the water tower view instead of the lake view, but oh well. To reflect all these different things we have going on in the complex, I'm going to clip a few more functional blocks into it. First, we have a warehouse, which is storing commercial goods so that we can get a steady flow of trucks in and out to represent the shipments of beer that are going out. Second, after clipping in this generic storefront, because I realized that the hotel needed some sort of street-facing entrance, I'm going to add a commercial and a residential block to try to represent the functionality of the hotel, with the commercial being the people who are employed and maybe a gift shop or something, and the residential blocks representing all the people who are coming in and out of the hotel. All the other buildings in the complex are already functional shops, so they should be fine just as they are. I ended up having a lot more space to work with here than the analogous spot in Duluth, so I'm going to make it so there are more mostly well-preserved shops farther down along the avenue. Although there are a couple more modern intrusions, like there's a big lot on the right where some older buildings have been demolished and replaced with a new office building that has a big parking lot of its own around it. And there's also a public parking lot in the spot where the next crossroad over used to be. using these hedges, I'm going to shield this ugly back alley from the trail that is running along the retaining wall here, and then extend that same trail out to the next cap and just leave it mostly undetailed so that we can come back to it another day whenever we decide to work on this end of town again. The reason that I didn't want to detail that part today is that there's a different trail system that needs some attention, and that's the lakewalk that runs alongside the rail next to the water. I thought that this area needed a bit more than just a plain trail, so I'm going to redo this stretch. First, I'm just going to take these rocks and run them all the way along this length of the shoreline, and then I'm going to add it back in using retaining walls. And that way it'll look like it's built right up against the shoreline, so you can be as close to the water as possible. Of course, the problem with this is that Sims won't actually walk on a retaining wall, so I have to clip in a pedestrian path. I'm using Network Multitool to add in the elevated vanilla path, just so I can make sure that it's in the right location. And then after that, I'm going to come back and upgrade it to an invisible version to get rid of the ugly railings while still leaving it functional. Just like earlier in the build, we end up with quite a bit more space than in the inspiration, so I thought it would be interesting to have a small forested embankment here where we have a lot of space between the rail and the path. Even at this point in the series, I'm still not sure exactly how to make a good-looking forest that fits into the theme, so I'm just taking some of my nicer-looking tree assets that look a little bit more wild and putting them down in clusters until it looks something like, well, a forest. And I also put a few smaller ones in these little gaps in between the trail and the shoreline, which I think looks nice without actually blocking your view of the lake if you were walking along the trail down here. After doing this, I thought it looked a bit too tall and dense, so I highlighted all of them with Move It and sized them down so they don't cut quite as much of a silhouette. In contrast to the Brewery district, I wanted this to be an area you could look down on from there without having it block your view of the lake. And one last thing before we're done. Right in the middle of recording cinematics, I realized that we actually have a bus line that's already running along this avenue here, so I'm just going to take that and add a couple stops along this avenue at the brewery complex. And with that done, we are finished with the city's historic brewery district and all the infrastructure that surrounds it. This video was an absolute monster to edit, so I hope it came out all right, and I hope that you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you on the next episode of Amaranth Bay.